Have you ever felt so alone that the silence has its own sound? A kind of ringing in your ears that fills up all the empty spaces? We all build walls around ourselves for protection, don't we? Walls made a habit of past hurts, of lessons taught to us by people who were just trying to protect themselves. But what happens when a storm comes along that's strong enough to knock those walls down? Today, I want to tell you a story that has stuck with me for a long, long time. It's a story from a place and a time that feels distant. Wyoming Territory, 1887. But the heart of it? Well, the heart of it feels like it could be happening right now, right next door. It's a story about a man who built his walls so high he almost forgot what the sun felt like. His name was Thomas Garrett. At just 24, he was the master of 300 acres of stubborn, unforgiven land. He was, in every sense of the word, alone. 5 years prior, a fever had swept through his home, taking both his parents and leaving him with their land, their cattle, and their caution. His father was a hard man who believed the world was a dangerous place and that a man's only true safety was in self-reliance. His mother, on her deathbed, had whispered the words that would become Thomas's creed. Keep your heart locked up tight, Tommy. This world ain't kind to those who feel too much. And Thomas listened. He became a ghost in his own life. He worked his ranch from sunup to sundown, never speaking more than was necessary for business. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't dance at the socials, didn't seek company in town. The other ranchers called him the hermit. He was a young man living an old man's life, convinced that loneliness was a small price to pay for peace. But the wild country of Wyoming has a way of reminding you that peace is never guaranteed. One afternoon, the sky, which had started clear, began to curdle. Dark clouds rolled in from the north with an unnatural speed. Thomas knew the signs. This wasn't just a storm. This was a blizzard. The air grew still and heavy, the birds vanished, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He'd miscalculated badly. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a blinding white fury. This was a killer blizzard, the kind that legends are made of, the kind that freezes cattle standing and leaves men lost just feet from their own front door. Lost, disoriented, and freezing with his hoarse bell stumbling beneath him, Thomas Garrett was facing the end. The walls he'd built were no match for the fury of nature. And then, through the swirling chaos, he saw it. A flicker of orange light, a ghost of a flame, barely visible but there. Fire meant people. People meant shelter. Pride, caution, his father's warnings, they were all luxuries he could no longer afford. He stumbled towards the light and found its source, a lone Apache teepee tucked against a rock outcropping. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a cold litany of mistrust. Can't trust 'em, son. They'll smile to your face and put a knife in your back. But the cold was a knife already at his throat. He knocked, his voice a frozen croak. Hello? I'm caught in the storm. The flap pulled aside, and a young Apache woman looked out. Behind her stood another, slightly older. They saw what he was, a white man, armed at their door, the very image of the danger that had stolen so much from their people. For a moment, nobody moved. The storm howled, and 3 worlds collided in the doorway of that teepee. Thomas, chattering through frozen teeth, managed to say, "Please, I mean no harm." And with a quiet nod, these 2 women, who had every reason in the world to turn him away, opened their home to a stranger. They saved his life. Inside, the warmth was a physical shock. They gave him a place by the fire, a cup of hot, bitter medicine tea, and they tended to his horse. Their names were Mary and Sarah. He learned they'd been sent to a mission school where they were given Christian names because their real ones were deemed too difficult for white tongues. There was no bitterness in their voices, just a quiet, weary acceptance. And in their simple, profound act of kindness, they laid the first crack in the wall around Thomas Garrett's heart. He was a man who had been taught to fear them, to see them as savages. But in that teepee, surrounded by the storm, he found more humanity than he'd known in 5 years. The true test, however, wasn't the storm outside, but the one that was about to arrive. The next day, after the blizzard passed, 3 riders appeared. It was a neighboring rancher, Jim Henderson, with his son Pete, and a hired hand named Dobbs, a man with cruelty in his eyes. When they saw the teepee and Mary and Sarah, their faces hardened. Dobbs spat into the pristine snow. "Apache squaws ain't supposed to be off the reservation." Jim, a more decent but law-abiding man, looked at Thomas. "You know I have to report this, son. It's the law." And right there, something inside Thomas snapped. Or maybe it finally clicked into place. He looked at the 2 women who had saved his life, who had shared their meager warmth without question. He looked at the smug, hateful faces of the man he was supposed to consider his own kind, and he made a choice. Storm didn't care about reservations, neither did their kindness. There's nothing to report here. He, the hermit, the man who avoided all conflict, stood his ground. He lied to the faces of his neighbors, broke the law, and risked everything for 2 women he had known for less than a day. It was the first time in his life he had chosen compassion over caution, connection over isolation. The riders eventually left, confused and angry, but they left. And in the silence that followed, Thomas felt a seismic shift within himself. The walls hadn't just cracked, a section had just come tumbling down. That single act of courage changed everything. It was the beginning of a secret, fragile relationship. Thomas started returning to the teepee, not just once, but regularly. At first, he told himself it was to repay their kindness. He'd bring supplies, flour, salt, coffee, blankets, things they desperately needed but were too proud to ask for. But soon, the pretense fell away. He wasn't just bringing supplies, he was bringing himself. He would sit by their fire, and for the first time in years, he would talk. Really talk. He told them about his ranch, his parents, his suffocating loneliness. And they listened. In return, they shared pieces of their own world with him. He learned about their traditions, their knowledge of the land, and the deep wounds of their past. He learned of the Sand Creek Massacre, a name he knew only as a distant horror, but which for them was a living grief that had stolen their family. Sarah, the older sister, had lost a husband. Mary had lost a future. They were survivors, living as fugitives in their own land, choosing a life of hardship and freedom over the slow death of the reservation. Have you ever met someone who sees you, truly sees you, maybe even better than you see yourself? That's what happened to Thomas. These women saw past the quiet, awkward rancher.
They saw the lonely boy, the man terrified of his own heart. One afternoon, sitting with Mary, their hands brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it sent a shockwave through him. He'd never held a woman's hand before. He'd never allowed himself to even imagine it. He was falling in love, and it terrified him as much as it thrilled him. He was breaking every rule he'd ever lived by, the rules of his father, the rules of society. And in doing so, he finally felt alive. The world came into color. The sunrises were more vibrant. The work on his ranch had purpose. The cold winter air felt crisp and new. His father had taught him that attachments make a man weak. But as he looked into Mary's eyes, he realized the truth. His isolation had been his weakness. This connection, this was strength. But the world has a way of testing newfound strength. One day in town, while picking up supplies, Thomas overheard two conversations that made his blood run cold. The first was a rumor. The Army was planning a sweep of the territory, clearing out any strays not on the reservation. The second was more immediate. It was the venomous whisper of Dobbs, the hired hand, telling Pete Henderson he'd seen smoke rising from the valley near Thomas's ranch. He suspected Thomas was hiding someone. The fragile peace was about to be shattered. Thomas raced back to the teepee, his heart pounding with a new kind of fear. Not for himself, but for them. He urged them to run, to disappear into the mountains. But Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of exhaustion. She said, "We have run our whole lives. No more. This is our home. We will not run from it." It was a staggering act of defiance. And it was in that moment of desperation that Thomas discovered he wasn't their only friend. The secret of their existence, it turned out, wasn't so secret after all. A quiet network of outcasts and decent souls had known about the two women in the valley. The Millers, a poor family Thomas had occasionally helped. Old Mrs. Chan, who ran the town laundry and saw more than she ever spoke of. Jorge, a Mexican vaquero, ostracized by the other cowboys. Even the town's blacksmith. They had all, in their own quiet ways, been watching over the sisters.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that even in the darkest of times, communities of compassion can exist in the shadows, hidden from the loud voices of hate. They all knew what a visit from the Army meant, and they knew what men like Dobbs were capable of. Together, this unlikely alliance of ranchers, immigrants, and outcasts made a plan. They would not let hate win. The attack came sooner than they expected. Dobbs and Pete, fueled by whiskey and prejudice, decided to handle the problem themselves before the Army arrived. At dawn, they rode into the valley, rifles ready. But they weren't met by two frightened women. They were met by a prepared defense. Thomas, Mary, and Sarah used their knowledge of the terrain, fighting back with a courage born of desperation. The fight was brutal and desperate, but just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, another sound filled the air, the thunder of more horses. For a heart-stopping moment, Thomas thought it was the Army, but it wasn't. Riding into the valley, grim-faced and determined, was Jim Henderson, followed by the Millers, Jorge, and the blacksmith. Jim, the man who had once insisted on the law,
rode right up to his own son. He didn't yell, he didn't draw his gun, he just looked at him with a gaze of profound disappointment and shame, and placed his horse between Pete's group and the teepee. One by one, the others formed a line beside him. It was a silent, unshakable wall of decent people saying, "No, not here, not today." Faced with the quiet judgment of their own community, Dobbs and Pete's drunken courage evaporated. They were outnumbered not by guns, but by conviction. They turned their horses and rode away in disgrace. Justice on that morning wasn't delivered by a badge or a gavel, but by the collective will of a community choosing kindness over cruelty. So, what happens after a victory like that? The immediate threat was gone, but the larger one, the army, still loomed. The story doesn't give us a simple happy ending because life rarely does. But what it does give us is something far more meaningful, a new beginning. Mary, Sarah, and Thomas were no longer alone. They were part of something larger than themselves. They had allies. They had friends. They had a community willing to stand with them. They were no longer hiding in fear. They were living with purpose. And Thomas Garrett, the man who started our story locked away in a prison of his own making, had been reborn. He discovered that true courage isn't found in isolation. It's found in connection. It's found in the terrifying, beautiful risk of opening your heart and fighting for the people you love. He learned that a home isn't just a plot of land you own, it's the people you build it with. Their future was uncertain, full of challenges, but for the first time, it was a future they would face together. And that, I think, is a truth that resonates just as powerfully today as it did on the harsh plains of Wyoming in 1887. The strongest walls aren't the ones we build to keep the world out, but the ones we build together to protect what truly matters within.